I'm 95 drafts deep on Underdog at this point, and it's really obvious to see which wide receivers the smartest drafters on Underdog think are good breakout wide receivers based on how high prices are rising on these wide receivers. So today I'm going to go through 6 breakout wide receivers that only the smartest drafters are taking right now in Underdog Fantasy Football Drafts for 2025. Just make sure to go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. So getting into my first guy, I think it's relatively obvious, so I want to get him out of the way as quick as possible. Rasheed Rice. Rasheed Rice was a huge draft pick of mine just 1 year ago, and it would have worked if he did not get injured, and I'm running the same thing back again. I've taken so much of Rasheed Rice, who has risen from wide receiver 22 to like 23 territory, all the way up to where he is right now in Underdog Drafts, which you can see on the screen. So I want to make it, again, very quick, and just by going through what Rasheed Rice did on a per-game basis in 2024. You can see on the screen, those are already impressive numbers for a wide receiver, and just based on those numbers alone, especially at 13.2 fantasy points per game, if you statted that out for a whole 17-game span, he would have been a top 10 wide receiver in 2024. But I actually think it was a little bit unfair. Rasheed Rice logged, technically, 4 games last season, but in week 4, that was the week that he got injured, and he only played 6% of the offensive snaps and recorded no stats in week 4. So I went ahead and just narrowed it down from weeks 1 to 3, and I got his average and his totals at each particular statistic there, so we could stat it out for a whole 17-game season. So in weeks 1 through 3, he had 29 targets. That's the equivalent of 9.7 targets per game. That's a really elite number right there that top 5 wide receivers are typically logging. 24 receptions for 8 receptions per game. That guy on a target basis is catching the majority of his passes. And of course, you could argue with me, well, yeah, it's because he runs a lot of slants. Bottom line is he's getting tons of volume when he is fully healthy. 288 receiving yards at 96 receiving yards per game. Again, when we stat that out for a full season of 17 games, you're going to see just how much that's worth. 2 touchdowns in 3 games. That's 0.67 touchdowns per game. 52.9 total fantasy points weeks 1 through 3 puts him at 17.6 fantasy points per game. Now, if you put that out to a 17-week pace for Rasheed Rice, that's 164.9 total targets. That's a really elite number right there. 136 receptions, 1,632 receiving yards, 11 touchdowns, and 299.2 fantasy points in a half PPR format. That would have made him last year's wide receiver 2 in fantasy football by a long shot. Like, he would have been about 30 to 40 points above the wide receiver 3. That's a crazy, crazy difference in points there. So Rasheed Rice, I don't think people fully understand what we were about to see from him in 2024, which makes it that much more unfortunate now, but also kind of a blessing in disguise because there still is concerns with people about his injury right now. Now, everything has been very, very positive for Rasheed Rice from the injury perspective. People are saying not only is he going to be 100% by week 1, dude's 100% basically right now and absolutely will be for training camp. So I think that kind of puts a lot of my injury concerns, which is the only real concern I have with him, puts a lot of those concerns to bed. And then the other thing is that this suspension situation here with Rasheed Rice, it does not look like he's going to be suspended for 2025. Now, I'm not the moral police here, so I'm not getting into the moral arguments of this. The bottom line is that this is an elite fantasy option who is still being priced at a really reasonable value, in my opinion. And this, of course, would make him a huge breakout. And I've also got more stuff that I'm going to get into him later on. So make sure to stay tuned because I want to move on to my next 2 guys that not as many people are drafting, but they should. Zay Flowers and Josh Downs. Now, Josh Downs in particular, I will say, has been definitely a hot topic in 2025 fantasy football amongst the fantasy football space. I've seen a lot of creators, a lot of people are kind of in on Josh Downs, particularly at his cost in fantasy football. So essentially what I wanted to do here was to highlight a video that I did about a month ago about breakout wide receivers and basically the process I get to find breakout wide receivers. It's very similar to the running back breakout video I did just a week ago. The process is very similar. So the qualifiers to be a breakout, in my opinion, is you have to play at least 10 games. Because what I'm studying here is not fantasy football finish. I want to study your fantasy points per game rather than your overall fantasy finish. Because if you play 10, 11, 12 games, you may not have been the wide receiver 12 or above. But if you were a top 12 wide receiver in fantasy points per game with 10 to 12 games under your belt, you are fully on your way to being a top 12 breakout wide receiver. So I think when you're studying breakouts at the wide receiver or running back position, it's better to study fantasy points per game to measure a true breakout. And then you need to finish at least 10 spots higher than your previous year's finish in fantasy football. So by that metric, Josh Downs technically was a breakout wide receiver in 2024, aside from the fact he wasn't a top 12 wide receiver in fantasy points per game. So obviously there's a huge list right here that you can see on the screen of all guys that have been tracking since 2014. Not going to get into this whole thing. But the main takeaways I want you to take away from is that the average age of a breakout is 23.8. That's the average age of a breakout wide receiver. And the other one that I want to make sure that everybody takes away is there was only one veteran below 70 total targets the year prior to the breakout, 2 veterans below 80 targets the year prior to the breakout, and no veterans had below 60 targets prior to the breakout. Those are just important points that I want to highlight here. So let's go ahead and look at the age a little bit closer here, because the age, in my opinion, is a really big determining factor when it comes to finding a fantasy breakout wide receiver, not only because that's the average age, 23.8, but there's also a really understandable reason here when you actually look at it. So as you can see on the list right here, you can see all the guys who broke out basically like up until the age of 27 right here. 23.7% of these guys, they broke out after the age of 25. Now, in my opinion, the reason why the majority of these guys are breaking out before the age of 25 is because 4 out of 8 guys at the age of 25 signed a contract extension after their breakout. So in other words, they get the big payday after their breakout season, which if you don't believe that if money's on the line, it's not going to incentivize you to play better, you and I are not living in the same universe. It definitely makes your incentives way higher when you've got millions and millions of dollars on the line here, which a lot of these players did. T. Higgins just got broken off in a really big way. Deebo Samuel got broken off a couple years back after his original breakout. Kenny Golladay was a breakout guy, and he was never to be seen again. These are guys that absolutely had massive seasons because there was freaking money on the line. And that's the same thing that we're seeing here with guys like Zay Flowers and Josh Downs. So what I essentially did here was I put all these guys who fit the breakout category in a full list, and you can see that full list on the screen, but I wanted to hone it down here and divide these guys into categories. And one of the main categories I wanted to study intensely, because again, it definitely matters when you're seeking a contract. I put these guys in a contract seeker category right here. So Zay Flowers, Josh Downs, those are 2 particular guys that I believe are seeking contracts. Now with Zay Flowers, it could very well be a 2026 breakout if it doesn't happen in 2025. Because the problem with Zay is that they do have a 5th-year option on him because he was a first-round pick just 2 seasons ago. So this is his 3rd season, which if he has a really good season, they might just break him off early. But if he doesn't, he might do it in 2026. So I could see less of an argument for Zay Flowers particularly being a breakout than there would be with Josh Downs. But the reason I like Zay right now is because even if he doesn't break out, he's not going to bust based on where you're taking him. Zay Flowers at his current value, like you're not going to get a bust on your hands. He's the wide receiver 30 on Underdog right now at a 52.6 overall ADP. So that means that he is just like not going to bust for you because he will not be lower than a wide receiver 30 finish. It just is not going to happen. So either way, you're going to come away with value from the draft position that you're taking Zay Flowers at. And that's ultimately the big reason I like Zay Flowers, is because not only do I view him as a guy who fits the breakout criteria, because he does, and he fits particularly the contract seekers, but it's also because even if he doesn't break out, he's going to give you value based on where you picked him at. But with Josh Downs here, I think there's actually more credence to this argument in particular, not only because he is a super cheap guy. Like in underdog drafts right now, Josh Downs the wide receiver 46. Now again, that price has risen from like wide receiver 50 range up to the wide receiver 46. So people are starting to catch on to this one a little bit. But I think it's even more so with Josh Downs because he wasn't a first round pick. So this guy doesn't have a 5th-year option. He's coming into his 3rd NFL season on a 4-year deal. So this guy is definitely looking to secure some big money in 2025. And I think the other thing that ultimately is concerning people the most with Josh Downs is obviously the quarterback situation. If it's Anthony Richardson, that's viewed as a big loss. I would agree with that. If it's Daniel Jones, that's also viewed as a big loss. But I would argue it's less of a loss if it's Daniel Jones. And I have a reality check on this one. Daniel Jones is going to be the starting quarterback for the Indianapolis Colts come week 1. It is absolutely going to happen. And I think Daniel Jones is going to ultimately fit the playing style of a guy like Josh Downs. Because you could think of Josh Downs as a more elite version of Wan'Dale Robinson. Wan'Dale Robinson, short route runner. Josh Downs, same deal, but Josh Downs, more explosion, more athleticism, and can take more plays to the house. I think Josh Downs is a no-brainer here at his price and a guy that absolutely can be a top 24 to top 20 wide receiver in 2025 fantasy football. Now, getting into my next guy right here, I also am really big on Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills in 2025. So if you look back to 2024, you could classify that as a breakout season for him as well. It was his best year of his career to date in 2024 as the wide receiver 38 in fantasy football. He had about 6.7 targets per game, almost 7 targets per game, only 4 receiving touchdowns, and 9.6 fantasy points per game in a half PPR format. So obviously, this was not a guy who was breaking fantasy football in 2024, and a lot of people did think that he ended up hitting his ceiling in 2024, not only because that was the best season to date, but also because of the fact he did get paid this offseason. So again, kind of fits with the contract seekers narrative here because he had his best season right before he gets paid. So Khalil Shakir, a lot of people do think he hit his ceiling here. Now, again, I think that it's kind of ironic how low his price is at the wide receiver 44 on Underdog right now when he finishes the wide receiver 38 last year. I don't particularly see a reason or any signs that he would be below a wide receiver 38 finish in 2025 because there's been really no big movements here to get a better wide receiver, and especially after they signed him to basically be their pseudo wide receiver 1. Now, I think a lot of people are going to want to immediately jump to Keon Coleman. I actually want to focus on Josh Allen for a second, and we will get to Keon Coleman. So let's go ahead and look at Josh Allen's career just for a minute here, because there was something obviously that was big in 2025, and I think a lot of people realize this, but I think until you see it, you won't realize that he had the lowest amount of thrown balls in 2024 since his second year in the NFL. So they ran the ball way more than they had been running in the last 6-7 years with Josh Allen as quarterback here. Now, I don't particularly think that that is going to keep up. I do believe that they're going to throw the ball a lot more in 2025, and I don't really particularly see how he's going to throw less than 500 or even potentially 555 passes again in 2025. I believe he's going to increase his throwing by a good 50 to 70 passes right here. Now, bringing it back to Keon Coleman, a lot of people are expecting Keon Coleman to step up. And I think the Buffalo Bills coaching staff is also expecting him to step up as well. I'm not a huge Keon Coleman believer at this point. I liked him a lot better last year, but after the year that we just saw with him, so many ups and downs, gets injured, and then is just not the same guy when he returns from the injury. It's reminding me, based on reports we're seeing, a lot of last year. Keon Coleman was reportedly very inconsistent in minicamp here. Now, again, don't put too much stock in minicamp because it's football and shorts. You don't want to make yourself vulnerable to drafting strategies based on minicamp news. But it is also something to note here because this is exactly what we saw with Keon Coleman the first time. If this was coming out of nowhere and it was some BS report about something we haven't seen, it wouldn't hold as much weight, but we did see Keon Coleman very inconsistent in 2024. So it's kind of looking like it's starting out on the same foot as it was in 2024, now in 2025. So I want to also reiterate this really quick. I'm not necessarily saying to avoid Keon Coleman in drafts. I think that his price is definitely worth drafting him. I've taken him quite a few times at the wide receiver 53 price point. But my thing with Khalil Shakir is we've seen it before. We have seen Khalil Shakir as a breakout wide receiver in 2024, and I believe that he gets better in 2025 because I think that they're just going to have to rely on him as their true wide receiver one, especially if Dalton Kincaid doesn't come through. When you add in the fact that I think that they're going to throw the ball more this year, he's just going to benefit from more targets than he got last year, and therefore is going to be a better fantasy option than he was in 2024. Now, getting to my next guy right here, this is definitely a deep cut. Demario Douglas, I think, is a really solid pick for where he's going in drafts. This is a best ball pick for sure. Like, do not waste your time drafting Demario Douglas in a redraft league in 2025. He's the wide receiver 72 in underdog drafts, and he will not be a drafted guy in fantasy football redraft leagues in 2025. Just pick him up off waivers if you want to at some point. But I think that the thing that people really forget about Demario Douglas here is that this is their leading wide receiver in New England for each of his first 2 seasons as an NFL wide receiver. Now, that doesn't say much because New England has had one of the worst passing offenses over the last 2 seasons in football. But it also is just something that is important to note here because not only has he established trust with his team, but he also established trust last year with Drake May, who is definitely primed for a breakout wide receiver himself. Now, I think obviously the 2 main concerning factors here, and the reason Douglas isn't going much higher than this, although he has increased in price, the reason he's not going much higher than this is because obviously Stephon Diggs is there now, and they drafted Kyle Williams in the 3rd round. So ultimately, if you're thinking logically here, they probably will lower his overall ceiling. And that's why I think at the wide receiver 72, it's still a solid price point because he has room to grow based on his price point. But I think that when you actually kind of break things down here, it's still not inconceivable to me that he's the wide receiver 1. Let me explain. Stephon Diggs is a wide receiver who's 31 years old and is coming off an injury. Like, this is just not a good scenario here for Stephon Diggs to become a really good wide receiver all over again. I think the days of him as a Buffalo Bill fantasy football stud are over. I don't believe that we're going to get that from Stephon Diggs. And I think when you add on the rocky offseason with some chop that he has had during 2025, if I know one thing about Mike Vrabel, he doesn't like that crap. So I don't think that he's exactly ingratiating himself with the coaching staff over there right now and not exactly proving that he's super focused on his craft in 2025. So I don't particularly think that Stephon Diggs is some major hurdle like he would have been 4 or 5 years ago. So that's one thing. The other thing about Kyle Williams is, yes, I have liked what we've been hearing about Kyle Williams, which has been mostly positive reports coming out of New England, and he definitely will be a starter in all likelihood. But who knows? I mean, this guy is a rookie, and he was a 3rd-round pick. Not exactly the best wide receiver in a weak wide receiver class. So that one's unpredictable as well. What we've seen here is pretty consistent from Demario Douglas, which is he's not an elite wide receiver. I'm not arguing he's going to be a top 12 guy, but at the wide receiver 72 price point, in a best ball format, if you can draft a wide receiver 72 who ends up finishing as the wide receiver 39, the wide receiver 40, the wide receiver 36, you're going to get enormous returns from that investment right there. And also, when you bring back the contract seeker players, this is a guy who also fits that category as well because, again, he was not a 1st-round pick with a 5th-year option. This is his 3rd season on a 4-year deal. He's looking for money, and I think everything that adds up in between those things can connect to a legitimate breakout wide receiver season for Demario Douglas as potentially a top 36 wide receiver. Now, the last guy I want to get into here is a rookie because I did want to highlight a rookie that I really like taking right now. Ameerah Ebuka. Ameerah Ebuka is the wide receiver 49 on underdog drafts right now. Now, that price point, again, it's going up. Like, he was the wide receiver 52, 53 just like a month ago. So people, again, are catching on to this one a little bit. This is one of the lowest prices for a 1st-round wide receiver in best ball that I can remember. And obviously last year there was like 6 wide receivers taken in the 1st round. So we did have some cheaper wide receivers last year. But in the 1st round this year, we only had a couple wide receivers taken. Like, this is an interesting price point for a player that ultimately is a pro-ready prospect. It's a prospect I really liked coming out of Wide Receiver University, Wide Receiver Factory, Ohio State. So this is a prospect that I really liked, and he's been getting rave reviews this offseason from coaches and players. And by the way, before the draft, there was a lot of GMs that said, like, this is one of the best players and one of the safest players that you could draft in the 2025 NFL class. Like, he was well regarded by all GMs across the league. And also, when you just factor in that reports that are positive, not just from reporters, but from coaches and players about a player, when you're getting rave reviews from coaches and players, that reminds me of when Washington Commanders players last year were talking about Jaden Daniels in such a positive light. Jackson Smith-Njigba, his rookie year, got talked about like he was the next greatest thing since sliced bread. Those two guys have worked out in fantasy football since then. So Ameerah Ebuka, to me, is on a really good start. And I've also been really suspicious all offseason. I've discussed this several times about the Tampa Bay wide receiver room. Now, I'm not here to say that this is not one of the best, if not the best, wide receiver rooms when all three of these guys are healthy. Even if you want to add in Jalen McMillan, that's a potential lead 4 wide receiver set right there in Tampa Bay. But the problem is, not all of these guys are healthy. Chris Godwin is obviously coming off a major ankle injury that he sustained in 2024 in basically the middle of the season. He's iffy for week 1. They're hopeful, but that doesn't mean anything. So this is a 29-year-old wide receiver. Keep that in mind. Mike Evans is going to be 32 years old at the start of 2025 as well. So when you think about things logically, I wonder if the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are worried and have seen something from 1 or 2 of those wide receivers that makes them concerned about their playing ability in 2025. I don't think you should believe it until you see it, but I think there's a lot of evidence that is stacking up here to say that Ameerah Ebuka, a pro-ready player, someone that everybody viewed as a player makes an immediate impact regardless of the team that he's on, is being drafted by a wide receiver room with 2 really good wide receivers. One of them's coming off an injury at 29, the other one's 32 years old. So I think that there's a realistic possibility here that Ameerah Ebuka is an immediate breakout at the wide receiver position. And again, based on his price point rising every single day, it's a guy that you should definitely get in on right now if you do want to take advantage of him. So if you do want to take advantage of Ameerah Ebuka or any of these wide receivers I just went through, you could go down in the comments. There's a link there for Underdog. You can use code FN to sign up, and they will match your first deposit 50% up to $1,000 of bonus cash. And get in on one of these drafts that are going live right now. Best Ball Mania is a huge one. There's tons of other drafts you can get in on to draft Ameerah Ebuka at its current price because it's going to continue to rise, and it's a player that ultimately has a lot of breakout potential. So let me know which wide receiver you believe is going to break out in 2025 in a big way. And if you want to see the breakout running backs that people are overlooking in 2025, click on this video right here.